When you hear the words London 1888, I bet your mind jumps straight to one name, right? Jack the Ripper. But what if I told you there's this completely terrifying and honestly almost entirely unknown prologue to history's most famous unsolved crime? Welcome to this explainer. Today we are pulling right back the curtain on the Whitechapel strangling panic. These were methodical, chilling rehearsals that history basically just forgot. I want you to picture the real Whitechapel in the winter of 1888. We're not talking about some romanticized, shiny movie set here. Think about a maze of choking, thick fog, heavy coal smoke, and these pitch-black, unlit alleyways. Now imagine walking those streets completely alone, when suddenly, out of absolute nowhere, a pair of silent hands seizes your throat from the dark. For women in early 1888, this was not just a nightmare. It was a very real, very terrifying reality that happened right before the Ripper even arrived on the scene. And the timing here, it's going to lodge in your mind like a splinter. Look at how this played out. In February 1888, the strangling attacks begin. They continue, almost methodically, all through the spring. But then, they just abruptly stop in mid-August. And what happens next? On August 31st, 1888, Mary Ann Nichols is murdered, the very first official Jack the Ripper victim. So the exact moment the strangling stopped is literally the exact moment the Ripper murders began. Now, what makes these attacks so incredibly chilling is that they made absolutely zero sense for the time. I mean, these were desperately poor women, but they weren't robbed. There was no sexual assault either. The attacker would simply seize them from behind, apply this very purposeful, controlled pressure to the throat, and then, right before the point of death, just release them and vanish back into the fog. And this wasn't just a one-off thing. We are talking about 14 recorded attacks, 14 different women choked to the absolute brink of unconsciousness. But because these victims actually survived, and frankly, because they were incredibly poor, Victorian authorities essentially just swept the whole thing under the rug. They completely ignored a systematic predator who was operating right under their noses. Modern behavioral science actually gives us a terrifying word for this exact type of behavior: rehearsal. You see, serial offenders will frequently use non-lethal violence to calibrate their methods. They're out there testing escape routes, they're timing police patrols, and they're learning exactly how much physical pressure it takes to silently incapacitate a human being. It makes it chillingly plausible that these 14 attacks were, quite literally, practice runs for Jack the Ripper. But hold on, because the story gets even stranger. Decades later, this controversial criminologist named Donald McCormick dropped an absolute bombshell. He claimed that he'd tracked down a secret private notebook kept by a Victorian police officer who actually walked the Whitechapel beat. And inside this notebook was one totally inexplicable detail. Beside every single one of those 14 attack sites, the officer discovered a handkerchief. And these handkerchiefs weren't just accidentally dropped either. According to this notebook, it was part of a highly calculated handkerchief code. They were deliberately tied to fixed objects, like lampposts or iron railings. They were always placed within exactly 100 yards of where a woman was going to be attacked. And here's the craziest part. They were left exactly 24 hours before the assault even happened. It was a signal system left out in the shadows for some unseen coordinator. Which obviously forces us to ask a totally mind-bending question. Was Jack the Ripper taking notes? Think about it. If this notebook was real, it suggests that these attacks were not just the chaotic, random work of a lone madman. Instead, they were highly organized tests being conducted on the open streets of London, possibly coordinated by a team or at least a terrifyingly sophisticated individual. To make the whole thing even more bizarre, this notebook detailed the specific designs of the handkerchiefs. Remember 14 attacks? Well, there were 14 completely distinct color combinations. Red with white dots, solid blue, yellow with a green border. Now, McCormick originally guessed these patterns meant something like, police are near. But the mind-blowing truth was actually hiding in plain sight for another 55 years. Get this, in 2014, a researcher decided to cross-reference that list of 14 color combinations, and they found an exact, almost impossible match. The 14 handkerchief colors perfectly matched the internal, unpublished livery colors of the very first 14 stations of the London Underground. And I mean in the exact sequence those stations were built. Their corporate colors matched the Stranglers' handkerchiefs to a T.
Just sit with that for a second. Are we looking at some massive citywide conspiracy or just an impossible coincidence? Because for a code to use internal railway colors back in 1888, the organizers would literally need access to unpublished corporate documents. Was some shadowy high society murder network actually using the train system as a map for violence? Or is this just the human brain doing what it does best, finding patterns in random noise?
Let's put our detective hats on for a second and look at the facts. On one hand, you have an incredibly cinematic, gripping conspiracy theory. On the other, you have forensic, historical reality. Both McCormick's list of handkerchiefs and the railway colors were drawn from standard, very common Victorian textile dyes. Statistically speaking, when you have 14 items, a random overlap isn't just possible, it's actually highly likely. And here is where the grand conspiracy really starts to crumble. Donald McCormick, the guy who supposedly found this notebook, well, he had a track record that modern historians consider deeply, deeply shady. Researchers have constantly tried to track down the documents he cited over the years, only to find that they literally did not exist. He was known to aggressively embellish the truth, and to this day, no one else has ever laid eyes on this mysterious constable's notebook. Yet, despite all of that, this theory still absolutely thrives on true crime forums today. Why? Well, because McCormick claimed it was a private diary. So its absence from official archives actually makes perfect sense to the people who believe it. You can't definitively prove the notebook never existed, right? So it just lives forever in that frustrating, unprovable gray area of history. But let's strip away all the intricate codes, the underground trains, and the internet sensationalism for a minute, because at the core of this explainer is a very profound historical truth. The conspiracy might be a total myth, but the 14 women were real. Official police records from early 1888 absolutely prove that women were being systematically attacked, choked, and released in Whitechapel. These were the forgotten survivors, real people, working-class women living in desperate, extreme poverty, just trying to survive in a city that looked the other way. Because they were poor, and crucially because they survived, the police just filed their reports and moved on. The press completely ignored them. They were entirely erased by the bloody spectacle of Jack the Ripper that followed just weeks later. So what should we really take away from all of this? I think it asks a pretty dark question. Why do we invent conspiracies to explain violence in the first place? As humans, we actually prefer the comfort of an elaborate code. A secret society is scary, sure, but it implies order. It implies someone, somewhere, is in control. And psychologically, that is so much easier for our minds to process than the chaotic, terrifying reality of a predator just randomly attacking vulnerable people in the dark. I want to leave you with this really haunting thought. The story of Jack the Ripper is always a reduction of a much larger story about who was safe and who was not. The Whitechapel stranglings were real. Those women were genuinely terrified and released into the fog, long before the rest of the world paid any attention. The rehearsals happened, even if the secret code didn't. Keep questioning what history chooses to remember, and more importantly, who it chooses to forget.